Rich neighbor called 911 on our family barbecue. She had no idea my dad was the police chief. Hello everyone, and welcome. Before we begin today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please leave the name of your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let's dive into the story and meet its main character. Sometimes the loudest siren isn't the one on a police cruiser. It's the sound of someone deciding you don't belong. The first thing I noticed that Saturday afternoon was the smell of hickory smoke curling through the warm July air. It mixed with my wife Angela's homemade barbecue sauce and the sweet scent of fresh-cut grass drifting across our backyard. My son Isaiah was laughing so hard he nearly dropped the football my younger daughter Naomi kept trying to steal from him, while my father quietly stood beside the grill, giving me the same cooking advice he had repeated every summer for the last 20 years. It was ordinary, peaceful, the kind of afternoon every family deserves. We had music playing softly through a small Bluetooth speaker, nothing loud enough to disturb anyone, just old soul classics that reminded my parents of their younger days. Neighbors on both sides waved earlier that morning. A few even smiled when they saw us setting up folding tables beneath the maple tree. Everything felt normal until I noticed Linda Whitmore standing across the street with her arms folded tightly against her expensive white sweater despite the 85-degree weather. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't waving. She was watching. I'd seen that look before during my 27 years in law enforcement. It was the expression of someone who had already made up her mind long before gathering a single fact. Linda had lived in our neighborhood for almost 8 years. She drove a luxury SUV that always looked freshly detailed, served on multiple community committees, and carried herself like the unofficial ruler of the block. She believed every lawn should look identical, every trash can should disappear before sunset, and every gathering should fit inside her personal definition of acceptable. We had exchanged polite greetings before, but there was always something behind her smile that never reached her eyes. I chose not to dwell on it. Life was too short to borrow trouble. Besides, Saturdays belonged to my family, not to other people's opinions. My wife handed me another plate of seasoned chicken, and I carefully laid each piece across the hot grill as the familiar sizzle filled the backyard. The smoke rose into the clear blue sky, carrying the smell of barbecue far beyond our fence. My daughter clapped her hands, announcing to everyone within earshot that Dad's ribs were almost ready. My father laughed, telling her she had inherited my impatience instead of my cooking skills. For a few precious minutes, nothing existed except family, food, and gratitude. Then everything changed. I noticed Linda lifting her phone. At first I assumed she was texting someone. Instead, she looked directly toward our backyard while speaking into it with an unusually serious expression. She paced slowly along the sidewalk, pointing once toward our house before stopping beside her mailbox. I couldn't hear a single word she said, but I recognized the rhythm immediately. Calm, deliberate, descriptive. It wasn't a casual conversation. My instincts quietly whispered that she was reporting something. Still, I refused to jump to conclusions. Maybe she was talking to a relative. Maybe she was discussing something completely unrelated. I turned another rack of ribs and smiled as Isaiah finally caught the football after missing it 3 times in a row. Less than 5 minutes later, the distant wail of sirens floated through the neighborhood. At first they sounded far away, barely noticeable beneath the laughter in our backyard. Then another joined in, and another. The sound grew louder until every conversation around the picnic table slowly faded away. My daughter stopped chasing her brother. Angela looked toward the street. My father quietly set down his paper plate. 3 patrol SUVs turned the corner almost simultaneously, their emergency lights flashing bright red and blue across the houses. They rolled to a stop directly in front of mine. Every neighbor stepped outside. Curtains shifted. Garage doors opened. A young officer stepped out first, followed by 2 more. One rested a hand near his radio as he looked toward our backyard. Another scanned the property with careful, practiced movements. No one raised their voice. No one rushed forward. The atmosphere wasn't chaotic. It was tense, professional, controlled. I slowly placed my barbecue tongs on the side shelf of the grill, wiped my hands on a kitchen towel, and quietly told my family, "Stay exactly where you are." Across the street, Linda Whitmore lowered her phone, folded her arms again, and smiled as if she had been waiting all afternoon for this exact moment. What she didn't know was that I had no intention of telling anyone who I was. Not yet. I kept my hands where everyone could see them, not because anyone had ordered me to, but because calm has a way of slowing down a situation before words ever can. The three officers walked through the open gate with measured steps, their expressions focused but professional. The youngest one glanced at the grill, then at the children, then back toward the street, as though he was trying to match what he saw with whatever information had come through the dispatcher. There was no shouting in my backyard, no argument, no signs of danger. There were paper plates stacked beside the picnic table, a cooler full of bottled water, my daughter coloring on the patio with sidewalk chalk, and my father quietly adjusting his reading glasses while holding a hamburger bun. None of it matched the urgency reflected by the flashing lights outside. The officer nearest to me offered a polite nod before introducing himself and explaining that they had received a report about a disturbance involving possible threats. His tone remained respectful, exactly the way good officers are trained to approach uncertain situations. I thanked him for letting me know and answered every question without hesitation. Yes, we were having a family barbecue. Yes, everyone present was a relative or close family friend. No, there had been no arguments. No, nobody was carrying weapons. No, there was no emergency. As we spoke, I could feel dozens of eyes watching from behind curtains and front porches. People who had never bothered to introduce themselves suddenly seemed fascinated by our backyard. That is the strange thing about flashing lights. They attract curiosity much faster than truth. Angela quietly gathered the younger children closer to the picnic table, smiling reassuringly so they would not become frightened. Isaiah stood beside his grandfather, trying to appear older than his 12 years, but I could see the questions forming behind his eyes. He had grown up hearing me remind him that respect always came before assumptions, and now he was watching that lesson unfold in real time. Across the street, Linda remained planted near her mailbox with both arms crossed, occasionally exchanging satisfied glances with another neighbor who had wandered outside after hearing the sirens. She looked less like someone concerned about safety and more like someone waiting for confirmation that her opinion had been proven correct. I had encountered that look many times throughout my career. Some people search for facts before reaching conclusions. Others search for conclusions first and hope the facts eventually cooperate. I never enjoyed proving those people wrong. I preferred letting reality do that work on its own. One of the officers politely asked whether anyone else had called to report a problem. I answered honestly that I had not spoken to anyone outside my family all afternoon. Another officer slowly walked around the edge of the backyard, not searching for trouble, but simply confirming what was already obvious. He paused beside the folding table covered with potato salad, baked beans, fresh fruit, and peach cobbler before exchanging a quick glance with his partner. Neither man looked alarmed. They looked confused. Their body language gradually shifted from responding to a possible emergency toward understanding they had interrupted an ordinary Saturday gathering. I noticed the youngest officer discreetly lowering the level of alert on his radio as his shoulders relaxed. Small details like that often reveal more than words. I still said nothing about my profession. I could have ended the uncertainty in less than 10 seconds simply by stating my title. Every officer present would have recognized my name immediately. Instead, I remained exactly what I was at that moment. A homeowner answering questions, a husband standing beside his wife, and a father making certain his children saw confidence instead of frustration. Titles are temporary. Character is not. If the officers handled this situation professionally without knowing who I was, then I would know our department's training was working exactly as intended. If they did not, then I needed to know that too. A few seconds later, one of the patrol vehicles received another radio transmission. The officer acknowledged it quietly before looking toward the street. A supervisor was arriving. That detail caught my attention, not because I was worried, but because dispatches rarely escalate without a reason. Someone had apparently described our family gathering as something much more serious than a neighborhood barbecue. I slowly folded the kitchen towel I had been using and placed it beside the grill while the smell of smoked ribs continued drifting through the air as though refusing to acknowledge the tension surrounding us. My father leaned closer and softly asked whether everything was going to be all right. I smiled and answered with complete confidence that it would. I believe that with every part of me because truth has a remarkable habit of remaining patient. It never needs to rush. As another vehicle turned onto our street, I noticed a familiar silhouette stepping out from the driver's side, and before anyone around me realized why the atmosphere was about to change, I quietly recognized the lieutenant walking toward my front yard. The lieutenant stepped through my front gate with the calm confidence that comes from years of experience, his polished badge reflecting the afternoon sunlight as he surveyed the scene before him. He did not rush. He did not appear alarmed. Instead, his eyes moved carefully from the patrol officers to my family, then to the picnic table, the grill, and finally to me. For the briefest moment, I saw recognition flash across his face. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly before he quickly returned to a neutral expression. He was a seasoned leader, and I knew he understood exactly what was happening. More importantly, he understood why I had not identified myself. Without saying a word to me, he first approached the officers already on scene and quietly asked for a summary of the call. They explained that dispatch had received a report describing a loud disturbance involving an aggressive group, possible intimidation of neighbors, and concern that someone might be armed. As I listened, each sentence sounded more disconnected from reality than the one before it. There was no disturbance. There had never been an argument. My children had been tossing a football across the yard only minutes earlier, and my father had spent most of the afternoon debating whether the ribs needed another 10 minutes on the smoker. The lieutenant slowly nodded while absorbing every detail, then looked around once more as if comparing the report with the actual evidence standing right in front of him. The difference could not have been more obvious. One of the younger officers quietly admitted that everyone they had spoken with inside the yard had been cooperative from the moment they arrived. Another added that he had observed nothing suggesting any immediate threat. Their professionalism made me proud, even though none of them realized why. Good officers adapt when facts change. They do not cling to first impressions simply because those impressions arrived through a radio. That lesson had always been one of the foundations of our department's training. Meanwhile, Linda remained across the street, visibly frustrated that the situation was not unfolding according to whatever picture she had imagined in her mind. She took several impatient steps toward the sidewalk and raised one arm, clearly trying to catch the attention of the lieutenant. He acknowledged her with a polite nod, but did not immediately walk over. Instead, he continued gathering information from the officers who had actually entered the property. That sequence mattered. Conclusions should always follow observation, never replace it. Angela quietly handed bottles of water to my father and the children, keeping everyone's attention focused on each other instead of the growing audience gathering outside our home. More neighbors had drifted onto their driveways, whispering among themselves while trying to piece together a story from incomplete fragments. I understood how quickly assumptions spread in neighborhoods like ours. Someone sees flashing lights, another person invents an explanation, and within minutes speculation begins sounding like established fact. That is precisely why facts deserve patience. They rarely arrive as quickly as rumors. The lieutenant finally walked toward me, stopping just a few feet away. His expression remained composed, but I could tell he was carefully choosing every word. Before he could speak, I smiled politely and gave the smallest shake of my head, subtle enough that only he would notice. It was not an act of secrecy. It was a request. Let the process finish. Let everyone continue doing exactly what they would do if I were simply another resident on the block. He understood immediately. Without missing a beat, he turned his attention back to the responding officers and calmly asked whether dispatch had preserved the original emergency call recording. One officer confirmed that every emergency call was automatically archived. The lieutenant then requested that the body camera footage from each responding officer be properly retained according to department policy. Hearing those instructions, I knew he had already recognized something important. This incident was no longer about a family barbecue. It was about determining whether public emergency resources had been used appropriately. Across the street, Linda's confident smile slowly disappeared as she watched the conversation unfold. She seemed surprised that nobody had rushed to remove us from our own backyard or treated her version of events as unquestionable truth. Instead, the officers continued documenting what they personally observed. The grill was still warm. Children were still laughing softly as the tension eased. Plates of food remained untouched on the picnic table. The evidence spoke far more clearly than assumptions ever could. As the lieutenant prepared to speak with the reporting party, He glanced back toward me one final time. His eyes carried the quiet understanding shared between professionals who both knew the next few minutes would reveal far more than anyone standing across the street expected. The lieutenant crossed the street at an unhurried pace, carrying nothing more than a small notepad and the quiet confidence of someone who understood that the truth rarely needed to raise its voice. Every conversation in the neighborhood seemed to stop at once. Even the children lowered their voices as if they sensed something important was unfolding. I stayed exactly where I was beside the grill, occasionally turning the ribs so they would not burn. The aroma of smoked hickory continued drifting through the yard, a strange reminder that ordinary life had not actually stopped simply because flashing lights had arrived. My father smiled faintly and whispered that good barbecue deserved patience no matter what else was happening. I laughed softly because he was right. Some things should never be rushed. From where I stood, I could not hear every word Linda was saying, but I could read enough from her gestures. She pointed repeatedly toward our house, then toward my family, occasionally spreading both hands as if emphasizing how serious the situation supposedly was. The lieutenant listened without interrupting. He did not nod in agreement. He did not argue. He simply allowed her to finish before asking what appeared to be several calm follow-up questions. I had conducted enough interviews throughout my career to recognize the rhythm immediately. Experienced investigators rarely chase dramatic statements. They look for details that can be verified. Times, distances, specific actions, exact words. Those small facts often determine whether a story becomes stronger or quietly falls apart. As the conversation continued, I noticed Linda beginning to answer more slowly. Her confident posture softened just enough for me to recognize uncertainty replacing certainty. Across the yard, one of the responding officers walked over to another neighbor who had voluntarily approached the sidewalk. A few moments later, a second neighbor joined the conversation. Nobody appeared upset. Nobody seemed frightened. In fact, several people casually described hearing children laughing and smelling barbecue long before the police arrived. One elderly couple even smiled while mentioning that they had been hoping someone might eventually invite them over to taste the ribs because they had smelled wonderful all afternoon. Those simple observations carried more weight than dramatic accusations because they came from people with nothing to gain. Facts have an unusual habit of gathering quiet allies. The lieutenant eventually returned to the patrol officers and asked dispatch to note that additional witnesses had voluntarily confirmed there was no disturbance before the arrival of law enforcement. He then requested the exact timeline of the emergency call, including the original wording used by the caller. Hearing that request, I realized he was beginning to examine not only what happened after officers arrived, but also what had motivated the response in the first place. That distinction mattered. Emergency systems exist because people truly need help every single day. Every inaccurate report consumes time, attention, and resources that might otherwise be available for someone facing a genuine crisis elsewhere in the city. Angela gently placed fresh lemonade on the picnic table as though refusing to surrender the afternoon entirely to unnecessary tension. My daughter asked whether everyone could finally eat because the corn on the cob was getting cold. Her innocent question drew a few smiles from the officers standing nearby. One of them quietly admitted that the food smelled incredible. Angela thanked him with the same kindness she offered every guest who visited our home. She treated people according to their character, not according to the uniforms they wore. Watching that interaction reminded me why I had always believed respect was contagious. Sometimes it spread just as quickly as suspicion, provided someone was willing to offer it first. The lieutenant looked toward our backyard once more before approaching me. His expression remained professional, but there was a new seriousness behind his eyes. He politely asked whether I would be willing to remain available while the department completed its documentation. I answered that I would cooperate fully for as long as necessary. He thanked me and quietly assured me that everyone had appreciated how calm my family had remained throughout the encounter. I simply nodded. Remaining calm had never been difficult. I trusted the process because I had helped build it. Still, I deliberately kept that thought to myself. The younger officers continued recording their observations exactly as policy required, documenting the peaceful conditions they had personally witnessed instead of relying solely on the initial report. As they worked, I saw several of them exchanging thoughtful glances, each beginning to recognize that this call was becoming something very different from what dispatch had originally described. Then the lieutenant received a brief update through his radio. He listened carefully, thanked the dispatcher, and slipped the radio back onto his shoulder. For just a moment, he looked directly at me with the faintest hint of understanding before turning back toward the officers. Whatever information had just reached him was about to shift the entire direction of the afternoon, and I had a feeling the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. The lieutenant lowered his hand from the radio and walked toward me with the same steady pace he had maintained all afternoon. But this time, there was something different in his expression. It was not surprise. It was recognition mixed with quiet respect. He stopped a few feet away, looked directly into my eyes, and said, "Sir, may I speak with you for just a moment?" I nodded and stepped slightly away from the grill so my family could continue enjoying what was left of the afternoon without feeling like they were standing in the middle of an investigation. The officers nearby naturally gave us a little space, although nobody stopped paying attention. Experience had taught them that important conversations often sounded completely ordinary. The lieutenant smiled politely before speaking in a voice only I could hear. "Chief Carter," he said softly, "I recognized you the moment I arrived." I smiled back. "I figured you did." He glanced toward the patrol officers and then back at me. "You never identified yourself." I shook my head. There was no reason to. Today, I am simply the homeowner. I wanted everyone to follow the same procedures they would use for any family in this neighborhood. He let out a slow breath and nodded. "I understand." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply watched as one of the younger officers finished documenting the peaceful backyard, while another continued speaking with neighbors who had volunteered to share what they had actually witnessed. Finally, the lieutenant smiled. "I think they passed your test." I looked across the yard at the officers. One had reassured my children without making promises he could not guarantee. Another had verified information before drawing conclusions. Every question had been respectful. Every action had followed policy. They did not know who I was. I answered quietly. That is exactly why their conduct matters. The lieutenant nodded again. I could not agree more. Our conversation was interrupted when the youngest responding officer approached, carrying a small notebook. He stopped when he realized he had walked into the middle of our discussion. His eyes moved from the lieutenant to me, then back again. The lieutenant smiled gently. "Officer Daniels, I would like you to meet Chief Marcus Carter." For a brief moment, the young officer simply blinked. Then his eyes widened as recognition replaced confusion. His posture straightened instinctively. "Chief, I did not realize." Before he could finish apologizing, I raised one hand with a friendly smile. "There is absolutely nothing to apologize for. You treated my family with professionalism from the moment you arrived. That is exactly what every citizen deserves." I watched the tension disappear from his face almost immediately. Relief replaced uncertainty. He thanked me, but I shook my head again. "Do not thank me. Thank your training and your judgment. You relied on facts instead of assumptions. Never lose that habit." The lieutenant quietly introduced the remaining officers, and each reacted with genuine surprise when they realized whose backyard they had been standing in for the past half hour. None of them appeared embarrassed because none of them had behaved inappropriately. Instead, they seemed almost proud that they had handled the situation exactly as they had been taught. That moment meant more to me than any formal salute ever could. Across the street, however, Linda's expression changed completely. Even from where I stood, I could see the color slowly drain from her face as she noticed the officers greeting me with unmistakable familiarity. She looked from one officer to another, clearly trying to understand why the atmosphere had shifted so dramatically without anyone raising a voice. She took several uncertain steps toward the sidewalk before stopping again, as though hoping she had misunderstood what she had just seen. The lieutenant excused himself and walked back toward her while Officer Daniels remained beside me. He quietly admitted that the original dispatch notes had described a dangerous confrontation involving aggressive behavior and possible criminal activity. Looking around the backyard once more, he shook his head almost in disbelief. "None of that was ever here, was it, Chief?" I smiled gently. Reality has a way of being much quieter than assumptions. He looked toward the children laughing near the picnic table and then back at the still-smoking grill. "Yes, sir. It certainly does." A few moments later, The lieutenant requested through dispatch that the original emergency call recording, the communications log, and all responding body camera footage be preserved according to departmental policy for administrative review. He also asked that the witness statements collected from neighboring residents be attached to the incident file. Those requests were routine, but they carried enormous significance. This afternoon was no longer about responding to an emergency. It had become an opportunity to determine whether the emergency system itself had been used responsibly. As I picked up my barbecue tongs once again and turned the ribs one final time, I realized that revealing my position had not changed the facts of the afternoon. It had simply confirmed something I had believed all along. The strongest authority in any community is never a title or a badge. It is a commitment to let truth speak before anyone else does. After the last patrol vehicle switched off its emergency lights, the atmosphere on our street changed in a way that only truth can change it. The tension did not disappear all at once. It slowly dissolved, replaced by thoughtful silence. The lieutenant walked back from speaking with Linda carrying the same calm expression he had worn since arriving. But I could tell from the careful way he closed his notebook that the conversation had raised more questions than answers. He thanked every neighbor who had volunteered a statement and reminded them that factual observations were always more valuable than assumptions. Several nodded in agreement before returning to their front porches, still trying to understand how an ordinary family barbecue had turned into a police response. Officer Daniels approached me once more and asked whether I would mind answering one additional question for the report. I told him to ask whatever he needed. He explained that dispatch had preserved the original emergency recording and that the wording used by the caller appeared significantly more alarming than anything officers had actually encountered. He carefully emphasized that he was not asking for my opinion about the caller, only whether anyone at the barbecue had engaged in behavior that might reasonably have been misunderstood by someone outside the property. I appreciated the question because it reflected intellectual honesty instead of confirmation bias. I looked around my backyard before answering. My father had spent most of the afternoon discussing baseball with Isaiah. Naomi had been drawing flowers and stars across the patio using washable sidewalk chalk. Angela had been arranging food while reminding everyone to drink enough water because the afternoon temperature had climbed into the mid-80s. A portable speaker had quietly played classic songs at a volume low enough that we could still hear birds in the trees. I smiled and answered that the loudest sound all afternoon had probably been my daughter celebrating every time someone complimented the corn on the cob. Officer Daniels chuckled as he wrote down my response. "That matches what every witness has described," he said. The lieutenant then joined us and informed me that dispatch supervisors had already flagged the incident for routine administrative review because the responding officer's observations differed substantially from the original report. He explained that preserving the emergency call, body camera recordings, dispatch timeline, and witness statements would allow the department to evaluate the entire sequence objectively. That was exactly what I had hoped would happen. Objective evidence protects everyone. It protects officers who respond professionally. It protects citizens who cooperate honestly. It also protects the integrity of emergency systems that millions of people depend upon every year. I thanked the lieutenant for following procedure instead of rushing toward conclusions. He smiled and replied that procedure exists precisely because emotions can cloud judgment. Across the street, Linda no longer looked confident. She remained near the edge of her driveway, watching every interaction as though searching for an explanation that would restore the certainty she had displayed earlier. Instead of dramatic confrontations or raised voices, she witnessed something far more powerful. She watched trained professionals compare claims against evidence. Nobody ignored her concerns, but nobody accepted them without verification either. That distinction defines real public service. Angela quietly invited the responding officers to take bottled water before returning to their patrol vehicles. At first, they politely declined because they did not want to appear unprofessional while still on duty. Then my father laughed and reminded them that staying hydrated was also part of doing their jobs well. The officers smiled, accepted the water with sincere gratitude, and thanked my family for remaining cooperative throughout the entire encounter. Isaiah watched everything closely before asking me a question that stayed with me long after the afternoon ended. "Dad," he said softly, "were you testing the officers because you are the chief?" I placed one hand gently on his shoulder and answered honestly, "No, son. I was trusting them to do the job the right way. There is an important difference." He thought about that for a moment before nodding. So the badge was never the point. I smiled because he had understood the lesson perfectly. Exactly. Character matters before titles do. The lieutenant overheard our conversation and quietly smiled before returning to his vehicle. As he prepared to leave, he informed me that investigators would review the complete record over the next several days, including the emergency call, available neighborhood security footage, and all documented witness accounts, simply to ensure that every part of the incident had been handled appropriately from beginning to end. I thanked him once again, and as the final patrol vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, the smell of smoked ribs drifted back across the yard. The children resumed laughing without hesitation, and I realized that the afternoon was no longer about proving who I was. It had become about allowing facts, patience, and proper procedure to reveal what had actually happened long before anyone chose to believe it. The following Monday morning, I arrived at headquarters before sunrise, just as I had done for years. The city was still quiet, and the first rays of light reflected across the glass entrance of the public safety building. My office overlooked downtown, but instead of walking directly inside, I paused for a moment with a cup of black coffee and thought about Saturday afternoon. Not because I had been personally offended, but because I kept returning to one question. If the responding officers had arrived professionally and respectfully, then what had caused such a dramatic difference between the emergency report and the reality they encountered? That answer mattered far beyond my own family. It mattered to every resident who depended on emergency services being available when they truly needed help. A few minutes later, Lieutenant Harris knocked on my office door carrying a neatly organized case folder. He placed it on my desk without saying a word until the door closed behind him. "Everything has been preserved," he said. "The dispatch recording, body camera footage, witness statements, radio traffic, and available neighborhood security videos." I thanked him and asked whether he had reviewed everything personally. He nodded. "Enough to know this deserves a complete administrative review." That was exactly what I expected. We were not searching for someone to blame. We were searching for the complete truth. Over the next several hours, our review team followed the same procedure we used for every incident requiring administrative evaluation. First came the emergency call, then the dispatch timeline, then each responding officer's body camera, synchronized by timestamp. Finally, witness interviews and available residential camera footage from neighboring homes that residents voluntarily agreed to provide. Every piece of information was examined in chronological order without skipping ahead. That sequence prevents assumptions from shaping conclusions. As the recordings played, one detail became impossible to ignore. Every independent source painted nearly the same picture. Families talking peacefully, children laughing, smoke rising from a barbecue grill, music playing softly in the background, neighbors walking dogs or watering flowers. Nothing suggested an emergency requiring the level of concern described during the original call. Even more revealing was how consistently the responding officers adapted after arriving. Instead of forcing the situation to match the dispatch description, they evaluated what they actually observed. Watching that professionalism unfold filled me with pride. They had trusted evidence over expectation. That is exactly what good policing demands. During the review, one of our civilian analysts noticed something else worth examining. The emergency communications database showed that the reporting address had generated several previous calls over the past few years involving neighborhood complaints. That observation alone proved nothing. Every call deserves to be evaluated on its own facts. However, policy required us to determine whether any broader pattern existed whenever repeated emergency reports raised similar concerns. The Records Division assembled the previous incident summaries without identifying conclusions in advance. We simply compared dates, officer observations, and final dispositions. As we worked through the files, an interesting pattern gradually emerged. Several earlier calls originating from the same address had ended in remarkably similar ways. Dispatch information suggested urgent neighborhood disturbances, yet responding officers repeatedly documented peaceful conditions upon arrival. Some involved children playing basketball before sunset. Another centered on a family birthday gathering. One involved neighbors talking near the sidewalk after a community cleanup event. None resulted in criminal charges because officers consistently found no evidence supporting the alarming descriptions contained in the initial reports. I leaned back in my chair and remained silent for several moments. Patterns deserve careful attention, but they never replace individual facts. Each incident still had to stand on its own. Even so, repeated inconsistencies naturally raised important questions about how emergency resources were being requested. I instructed the review team to continue documenting only verifiable information and to avoid speculation. If a pattern existed, the evidence would establish it without anyone needing dramatic language. By late afternoon, the administrative package had grown considerably. Every statement matched its supporting documentation. Every timeline aligned with recorded timestamps. Every conclusion rested on objective evidence rather than personal opinion. Before leaving for the evening, I looked once more through my office window as the city lights slowly replaced the afternoon sun. I realized the story had quietly transformed into something much larger than my own family. This was no longer about one Saturday barbecue or one uncomfortable misunderstanding. It had become an opportunity to strengthen public trust by demonstrating that every report, every response, and every decision should ultimately be measured against facts. When procedure remains stronger than emotion, justice does not need dramatic moments to succeed. It simply continues moving forward one verified detail at a time. 2 weeks later, the administrative review reached its conclusion, not with dramatic speeches or emotional headlines, but with a carefully documented report supported by recordings, witness statements, dispatch logs, and verified timelines. That was exactly how it should have been. The purpose of the review had never been to embarrass anyone. It was to protect the integrity of a system that every family depends upon during genuine emergencies. Lieutenant Harris stopped by my office carrying the final summary. He placed the folder on my desk and smiled quietly. "Everything is complete," he said. I thanked him before opening the report and reading it from beginning to end without skipping a single page. Every finding traced back to objective evidence. The responding officers had followed department policy appropriately after arriving on scene. Their observations consistently matched one another as well as the independent witness statements and available residential security recordings. Most importantly, the review confirmed that the actual conditions observed at our home differed substantially from the urgent description provided during the emergency call. Because of those findings, the incident was formally referred through the established legal and administrative channels responsible for evaluating inaccurate emergency reports. That decision was not based on my position within the department. In fact, the review package deliberately omitted any recommendation connected to my role. It focused entirely on evidence, procedure, and the documented facts. I appreciated that more than anyone realized. Justice carries greater weight when it stands on documentation instead of personalities. A few days later, I learned that the appropriate authorities had met with Linda to discuss the findings and explain the potential consequences of providing inaccurate information to emergency dispatchers. I was not present during that meeting, nor did I ask to be. It was handled by the offices responsible for those matters, exactly as policy required. What I did hear afterward was that the conversation was respectful, professional, and firmly grounded in the evidence collected throughout the review. The recordings, timelines, and witness statements spoke more clearly than opinions ever could. Around the same time, several neighbors unexpectedly knocked on our front door one evening. They were carrying homemade desserts, fresh bread, and one very enthusiastic apology. An elderly couple admitted they had initially assumed something terrible had happened simply because they saw so many patrol vehicles arriving at once. Another neighbor confessed that he had repeated rumors before learning the actual facts. None of them tried to excuse those mistakes. Instead, they wanted to clear the air face to face. I invited everyone into the backyard where the same picnic table still stood beneath the maple tree. The grill had cooled long ago, but the feeling of welcome remained exactly the same. We talked for nearly 2 hours about neighborhood trust, emergency services, and how easily assumptions can spread faster than verified information. Those conversations accomplished more than any argument ever could. People left with a better understanding of one another because they had finally chosen to listen instead of speculate. Even Officer Daniels visited one weekend while off duty to thank my family again for the lesson he said he would carry throughout his career. He admitted that before that Saturday, he had believed the most difficult part of police work involved responding quickly. Afterward, he realized the greater challenge was slowing down long enough to separate verified facts from confident assumptions. Hearing that reminded me why thoughtful officers become exceptional public servants over time. My children noticed changes as well. Isaiah told me that several classmates had asked what really happened after hearing different stories from adults in the neighborhood. Instead of becoming angry, he simply smiled and said, "The truth took a little longer to arrive." When he shared that with me, I could not have been prouder. Naomi, in her own wonderfully simple way, announced that the next family barbecue should include enough hamburgers for every neighbor on the block because people are nicer after they eat together. I laughed because sometimes children discover solutions that adults overlook. Looking back, I realized the most meaningful outcome had nothing to do with titles, investigations, or official reports. It was the quiet restoration of trust. The emergency system had functioned exactly as it was designed to function. Officers responded. Supervisors reviewed. Evidence was preserved. Facts were verified. Appropriate procedures followed. Along the way, a neighborhood learned that assumptions may travel quickly, but they rarely finish the journey. Truth moves at a steadier pace, gathering proof with every step until there is nothing left to argue about. By the time the review officially closed, no one remembered the flashing lights as clearly as they remembered the lesson they left behind. Real justice is never built on who speaks first. It is built on who is willing to wait for the facts. About a month after that unforgettable Saturday, the smell of hickory smoke once again drifted through our backyard, almost identical to the afternoon that had changed so much more than any of us realized. This time, however, the atmosphere felt different from the moment I lit the grill. Instead of quiet curiosity behind closed curtains, neighbors walked across the street carrying folding chairs, homemade pies, bowls of potato salad, and enough desserts to feed twice the number of people we had invited. Someone jokingly called it the first unofficial neighborhood barbecue, and before long the name stuck. Children from every corner of the block chased footballs across the grass together without anyone keeping score. My father stood proudly beside the smoker, explaining his secret rib recipe to anyone patient enough to listen. Angela laughed with neighbors who only weeks earlier had barely known our names, while Naomi proudly decorated the picnic tables with colorful handmade signs that read, "Everyone is welcome." Isaiah helped younger children organize a friendly football game, stopping every few minutes to make sure the smallest players had a chance to touch the ball. Watching him naturally include everyone reminded me that kindness often spreads quietly from one generation to the next. Officer Daniel stopped by after finishing his shift, wearing jeans instead of a uniform, carrying nothing except a peach cobbler baked by his grandmother. Lieutenant Harris arrived a little later with his wife, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw him completely relaxed, laughing over stories that had nothing to do with work. Nobody discussed investigations. Nobody talked about reports or procedures. They talked about families, vacations, favorite barbecue recipes, and the best fishing spots within an hour of town. That was exactly the community I had hoped this neighborhood could become. Even some residents who had never spoken to one another before that difficult afternoon found themselves sitting together beneath the shade of the maple tree, discovering shared interests they never knew existed. Linda's house remained quiet across the street. Her curtains stayed closed for most of the afternoon. I noticed her looking through the front window once or twice before quietly stepping back out of sight. I felt no satisfaction from that. I had never wanted humiliation for anyone. I had wanted accountability, fairness, and an opportunity for people to learn from the consequences of their choices. Those are very different things. Holding resentment would not improve the neighborhood. Building trust would. As the sun slowly began to sink behind the trees, casting long golden shadows across the backyard, I walked over to the grill one last time and flipped the final rack of ribs while breathing in that familiar mixture of smoke, charcoal, and summer air. It struck me that the same smell had opened this story weeks earlier, but now it carried an entirely different meaning. Back then it had become the excuse for suspicion. Today it had become the reason people gathered together. The smoke had never changed. Only the way people chose to see it had. Later that evening, after most of our guests had gone home carrying leftovers wrapped in aluminum foil, Isaiah sat beside me on the back porch watching fireflies appear across the yard. After a long silence, he asked me whether I regretted never telling the officers who I was when they first arrived. I smiled, thinking carefully before answering. No, son. If I had introduced myself as the chief before they had the chance to do their jobs, I would never have learned whether they treated every family with the same respect they showed ours. He nodded thoughtfully. And they did. Yes, I answered. They did. He looked out toward the quiet street before asking one final question. So what was the most important thing that happened that day? I looked around at the empty picnic tables, the cooling grill, the football resting in the grass, the chalk drawings Naomi had refused to wash away, and the maple tree that had silently witnessed everything from beginning to end. The most important thing, I said, was that the truth did not need anyone to shout for it. It simply needed people willing to listen. Years in law enforcement had taught me that a badge can open doors, but it cannot create integrity. A title can earn attention, but it cannot replace character. Real authority is measured by how faithfully someone follows the law even when nobody knows who they are. That Saturday reminded me that justice is strongest when it belongs equally to every citizen, not just the people with influence or recognition. Whenever I smell barbecue drifting through a quiet neighborhood now, I no longer think about flashing lights or unnecessary suspicion. I think about the officers who trusted evidence over assumptions, the neighbors who chose honesty over rumors, the children who proved forgiveness comes more naturally than prejudice, and the simple afternoon that reminded an entire community that respect is not something we earn after learning another person's title. It is something we choose to give before we know it. And that, more than any badge I have ever worn, remains the lesson I hope my children carry with them for the rest of their lives.